may be that I'm left looking very, very foolish in a few weeks' time, but I do think that Trump does have a plan, and that plan has a certain cold logic to it.
How embarrassing that we cannot defend our own airbase in Cyprus. I mean, isn't that shocking? I suppose you don't earn the right to participate when that's the state of your armed forces, you know?
I'll probably be long gone, but when Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are in their care homes decades hence, I think it'll be the case that the nurse leaning over either of them will be saying, "Who's this Liz Truss, dear, that you keep talking about?" Hello and welcome to Quite Right, the Spectator's podcast, with me, Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And me, Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer.
And this week, Maddie and I will be disagreeing, but agreeably, on the war in Iran, and we'll also be considering Rachel Reeves' spring forecast. Was it all just crystal balls?
Michael, there's only one story dominating the news this week, which is obviously the US strike on Iran, which killed the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. And now we're seeing counter-strikes from Iran to various countries in the region. So an extraordinary amount has changed even in a very short space of time. What is your initial reaction to what we've seen?
Well, I am cautiously optimistic. And I know that for many listeners, yet another American intervention in the Middle East will bring back all sorts of feelings of déjà vu all over again. The sense that you have a reckless Republican president unleashing hell on a tyrant because they fear that they're about to develop weapons of mass destruction, and that American president doesn't appear to have a long-term plan for the region, will make people think, has nothing been learnt from history? And it will even make some people, I think, probably nostalgic for the relative restraint of George W. Bush. However, I do think on this occasion there is method in the madness, and it may be that I'm left looking very, very foolish in a few weeks' time, but I do think that Trump does have a plan, and that plan has a certain cold logic to it.
What do you think is the logic behind it? What is the plan?
I think it is to say to the regime and its supporters, there's no way out for you, that we can hunt you down, we can eliminate you, we have the intelligence from our own operatives and also, of course, from Israel, and you have a choice. You can either wait until we catch up with you, or you can surrender. You can be part of a new future for Iran. The fact that Trump and Rubio and Hegseth have said that they'll do whatever is required, the fact that Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, while obviously not relishing the thought of boots on the ground, has said that if necessary, that might be something that would be required, means, to my mind, that what they're seeking to do is to show a willingness to take out anyone who stands in the way of a transition to a different type of government in Iran. That type of government, again, may not necessarily be an enlightened and democratic one, but I think what the Americans want is a leadership in Iran that will forswear nuclear ambitions and seek an accommodation with its neighbours.
That's really interesting because I suppose for me, one area in which this intervention seems very, very different to the recent kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela is that it's not yet clear who in the regime is sort of Trump's man in Tehran, or woman, probably man, in Tehran, that you could work with in the manner that they've clearly identified Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela. I almost wondered if this was less of perhaps the regime change or a nation-building exercise and more of a bit of classic Trumpy gunboat diplomacy where you kind of go in and give the Millers a bit of a kicking. But essentially, I'm not sure if the political will is there in America for it to become a prolonged intervention. And that's where I think there are questions about what is the long-term plan beyond just, temporarily humbling the theocrats. Is the idea that if you give them a rap across the knuckles, they'll stop persecuting their own people? Is that kind of the idea?
I think it's both more brutal and less long-term than that. So I think you're right that what Trump doesn't want to do is engage in nation building. He doesn't want to have American troops committed to Iran as they were in Iraq and Afghanistan for years to come. What he does want to do is to demonstrate the literally awesome power of the American military, equipped with the intelligence that they enjoy, to be able to hunt down and kill, in horrific terms, anyone who stands in the way of essentially treating with American power. And it will be the case that having decapitated the top of the regime, they will work their way down. And I think it's also the case that there will be people, not necessarily noble figures, not the Garibaldis of Iran, who are waiting to take over. I think what there will be people, whether it's in the military or in the political elites in Iran, who will see the way the wind is blowing, and who will play the role that, without wanting to be sort of too historically recherche, that General Monk played in 1660.
Yes, seeing which way the wind is blowing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So just as he decided, having been in Cromwell's New Model Army, that the time had come for King Charles II, I think it will be the case that there will be people in the Iranian elites that will see the way the wind is blowing. And funnily enough, one of the people who is in the House of Commons who best understands the region and who best understands Iran is Tom Tugendhat. And he's been dropping broad hints that there are people within the Iranian elite, known actually to our intelligence services, who might be capable of playing that role. It may turn out to be a cockeyed optimism on my part, but insofar as one can discern exactly what Trump wants, based on what Rubio has said, based even on what J.D. Vance has said about America intervening sparingly, but when it does with horrific force, I think that is the strategy.
Well, I would say they haven't really been particularly sparing in their interventions recently, which is basically what happens to every US president in their second term. They always seem to end up embroiled in some kind of foreign policy endeavour. Even someone like Obama, who went in almost on a ticket of being anti the war and not George Bush. I wonder about, though, what you're saying about sort of taking out the leaders and the elites, because as I understand it, it's a very decentralised system. You have the mullahs, obviously, but already, for example, since the supreme leader was taken out, he's been replaced by a kind of mini council of 2 or 3 new guys, I think. And then the IRGC is its own beast and massive. And the other question is just, it's very hard to know, because the transfer of information out of Iran is so complicated. What do the population think? This is something that I just don't know, because I feel we're getting a diet of what we're shown on essentially social media, because a lot of the legacy media has been unable to broadcast the news adequately in time. It's really been left by the wayside. So you get a better impression from your social media feeds, but equally that will be partial. Maybe my algorithm is showing me videos of Iranians celebrating, and I don't doubt that many are celebrating, but how many Iranians support the theocrats? I would imagine fewer after the mass murder of tens of thousands of innocent people on the streets. But, it's still, there's a lot of people that will have some link to the Iranian state. A lot of people will work for it or be involved somehow in the IRGC network. I wonder if this is not, I don't know, it's a huge gamble, at least.
It is certainly a gamble. And you make a number of very powerful points. The first is, as you say, that the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, are more than just an elite military formation imbued with ideological fervour. In fact, that's how they started, but they've morphed. They've morphed, in essence, to become a sort of organised mafia. They have big property interests in Iran, and a bit like the People's Liberation Army in China. They've moved beyond simply being the military arm of the state to a state within a state. And it will be the case that they will be jealous of their economic interests, and some of them, of course, will be ideologically motivated. But overall, the impression that our diplomats have had recently of Iran is that whatever the degree of ideological fervour that gripped the regime at the beginning of the Islamic Revolution and still holds appeal to a significant number, it's regime survival, personal survival, that is the key governing factor of many of these decision makers. And if they believe, and I'm certain that this message will have been communicated to them, if they believe that they can do a deal that they can have a future if they comply with American demands and with, also, to be fair, the requirements of their neighbours, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, then they may reason that it is better to move from defiance to some form of coexistence.
And what do you think the impact is of the views of people in Western countries, let's say, about the wisdom of participating? I mean, I think we can probably talk about
Yes.
Britain in a second, but America, I don't see great demand for it, and certainly scepticism about long-term entanglement. But, the question of what is the long-term plan, I think, is like the fundamental one. History tells us that regime change often ends badly, but often at the beginning, there is
Yes,
greater
quite.
public support for it.
No,
but especially when there come to be knock-on effects. So, for example, America will probably be safe for this because it didn't make the catastrophic decision to completely neglect its own domestic energy reserves while becoming more reliant on imports as we have done. But there will be Western countries where, for example, the Strait of Hormuz gets complicated, which is already essentially closed to commercial shipping. If that has an effect on food inflation, energy inflation, people may not feel so positively as they do.
Again, I think that the broad point you make about regime change or foreign intervention having unintended consequences is it's an impeccable small c conservative, large T Tory instinct that don't go abroad seeking to slay dragons because there are more than enough problems at home. And I think you're also right that American public opinion, chastened by the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan, is very suspicious of these ventures. In fact, that's one of the reasons why Trump secured the Republican nomination. It's one of the arguments that J.D. Vance made for Trump.
Yeah.
Therefore, you do not have this natural sort of, rally behind the flag patriotism in America, but you don't have widespread support for this venture in the way that you did for Iraq and Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11. That is certainly true. I think, however, that if it is the case that a change can be effected in how Iran operates, if it's the case that its neighbours in the Gulf feel that there is a new set of leaders in town with whom they can do business, literally, then I think that is a brighter economic future, not just for the Middle East and for oil-producing countries, but more broadly for the world. So my optimism may well be a consequence of my naive assumption that Trump, the crude calculator of power dynamics, knows what he's doing here in the way that he did in Venezuela, in the way that he did with the Abraham Accords. But it may be that he has succumbed to hubris. It may be that this is one step too far in an assertion of American power.
I was really struck by the interview with Marco Rubio where he's asked about the justification for the attacks, and he basically says, well, we knew Israel was going to do it, and we decided that we would suffer greater casualties by not participating, which is quite an extraordinary omission for the Secretary of State to be making. But also, I'm not sure how that will play on the American right, the idea that their foreign policy is being dictated by what Israel decides to do. That's already a big point of contention on the American right already. I also wanted to ask you about what it means that Iran, in, I suppose, quite characteristic form, has lashed out at so many neighbouring countries. I mean, obviously, it's so funny that Keir Starmer justified our non-participation with like a load of his usual legalistic waffle. And then within a few minutes of that, our base in Cyprus has been attacked by Iran.
The statement by Marco Rubio struck me as a very undiplomatic thing to say. I don't think that if what you want to do is to assert American power, you don't say, well, we're doing this because someone else, even if it's Israel, perhaps especially if it's Israel, given where American public opinion is, has been the tail wagging the dog. I think that was very ill-advised of him. There may be reasoning behind his comments, but you are right that opinion against Israel has hardened in America to the point where a majority of younger voters and a majority of Democrats are unsympathetic to Israel. And on the hard right of the Republican Party, people like Tucker Carlson have been very critical of Israel's influence in American politics. I take a very different view from them, but you've got to be aware of that context. In the Gulf, I think the view of most Gulf leaders will be that the Iranian regime has been trying to undermine them. And their view will be that either they could have tried to reach a modus vivendi with Iran, and America and Israel should have, kept out. But now that America and Israel have acted, they've got to finish the job, because the Gulf powers cannot tolerate a wounded, vindictive, and still ideologically captured Iran for the reasons that you mention. And so they will want to see a successful conclusion of this military enterprise. And certainly for the Saudis, who are embarking on economic modernization, the last thing they want is the Iranian mafia zealot state shaking things up. So they will want a conclusion to this. So Trump at the moment has Gulf support, but only insofar as he can convince or remain able to convince those Gulf states that he will finish the job.
But I think a timely solution will be necessary. Otherwise, the Gulf states will be in real trouble. So dependent are they on the shipping routes and just for the most basic amenities. I've got a few friends in Dubai, and they say that things seem to have calmed down a little bit, but it's not clear when people can get flights out of there. The regime have been paying for people trapped in hotels. They've just been subsidising the hotels to keep housing people. But that doesn't feel like the most sustainable situation either. It seems like they're trying very hard to put a good spin, because they know that Dubai has to be perceived as a safe and reliable place. Otherwise, people will stop going. So the knock-on effects of them not doing this are perhaps even greater than the cost of housing people in the short term.
There is a sense that you can get that people in Dubai have been picnicking on the edge of a volcano. But actually, to be fair, the Emiratis have done everything possible in order to ensure internally that Dubai feels safe, the obvious approach that they take towards crime, but also the approach they take towards extremism, dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood in exemplary fashion. But for them, it is, to use the most overused word in geopolitics, existential, because, as you say, there they sit, this wealthy citadel just across the Gulf from Iran. They need to ensure that Iran is comprehensively defanged if their economic growth, their attractiveness to expats, their attractiveness to investment, their booming tourist trade succeeds. And again, one of the reasons why I'm sort of cautiously optimistic is that there are so many equities, so many powers, the Saudis, the Emiratis, now the Qataris and the Bahrainis, as well as Israel and America, who are invested in making sure that we don't have a resurgent Iran after all this.
Perhaps we should have a think about what our country's reaction has been. I think Keir Starmer's statement on this was, at the very least, seemed fairly muddled. On the one hand, he defended the decision not to allow the US access to our bases and to participate in the first strikes on the basis of, you guessed it, international law, which was quite funny because actually in a conflict that's involving America, Israel and Iran, I really can't think there are fewer countries that give fewer hoots about international law than those guys, And nevertheless, he was sticking to his treasured shibboleths. It was almost touching, bringing a spoon to a gunfight sort of thing.
Precisely. It is like someone walking into the OK Corral, as you say, and saying, "Chaps, I'm afraid."
Sorry.
I'm trying to be afraid.
Mr. Holiday. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then saying,
"There's no fighting in the war room."
Yes, there's no Queensberry rules being applied here.
Yeah.
But it's worse than that, in that he shows, look, an attachment to international law in and of itself. I mean, I have my criticisms, but it's not necessarily always a bad thing. And his statement that you need to have a long-term plan, that is not ipso facto foolish.
No,
However, he clings to both of those phrases. And what he seems not to have done is to, as anyone in charge of our defence and strategy should be, to have thought a few steps ahead, because it was almost inevitable, following on from this conflict, that Britain would be drawn in, that our deployments abroad, as you mentioned in Cyprus, would find themselves inveigled. So he moved from a situation of saying, we have nothing to do and we're standing aloof, to, British citizens, British bases, our other interests are being affected. Therefore, we will give the Americans the right to use our bases to strike at Iran's ballistic missiles, still keeping it very precise, very legalistic. When in fact, some people will think, well, look, if the Iranians are hitting us, we should hit them.
Yeah.
Now, there's a perfectly respectable view, which is actually we should have made it clear to the Iranians and to the world that we are going to have absolutely nothing to do with this. The challenge that Starmer has is that the narrowly legalistic approach that he's chosen to take leaves him neither betwixt nor between.
Well, I'm torn on this one because on the one hand, I think Starmer's position was confused and it was made to look particularly weak given what came shortly after the first outburst. And then I felt, was doing a bit of post facto justification. But I do think he has a point about a plan for what the bombing is meant to achieve. I'm afraid I do return to practically every attempt at Western intervention. I think about, for example, the mass celebration that greeted the toppling of the Assad regime not long ago. And then, within months, the Islamists that replaced Assad was busy killing the Alawites, Christians, Druze, and every other ethnic and religious minority in the region. I think this is all perfectly legitimate, but Starmer didn't choose to really frame it in those terms.
No.
It was much more about the Starmer international law vision of the world. But I do think that there is something to be said for skepticism. And I also I don't like the way that somehow this debate is shaping up, that people that hold this view are being kind of like villainised as if they want the mullahs to be in charge forever. It's sort of echoes of the Iraq War when people were saying, why do you support the Ba'ath movement?
No. I think that is fair. And I recognise that I am probably, it's not that I'm gung-ho, I've become more inclined to give Trump the benefit of the doubt, not morally, but strategically, in his foreign policy interventions. But going back also to what I said earlier, it was striking that Sir Edward Lee, the father of the House, asked a question of Keir Starmer, and it was the case that he and Starmer broadly seemed to be in accord with what one might call measured scepticism towards the intervention overall.
Yes.
And I remember during the debates on the Iraq War and the Syrian intervention, and hands up, I was in favour of both. So people might say, you are twice bitten and not in the least shy, Gove. But there was a very important debate or conversation that was occurring on the right at that time between those people who took a trad view of the national interest and a proper scepticism about the way in which things can go wrong abroad. And it is interesting that outside Parliament, on the right, there have been people who have, for example, in Reform, been enthusiastic about it, while Restore, the Rupert Lowe outfit, has been sceptical. And you've had writers on the right, like Tim Stanley in the Daily Telegraph, and obviously Peter Hitchens from the Mail Group, who have been classically cautious about this. I hope that I'm not utopian. I don't believe that any intervention will turn Iran tomorrow into, a slightly more temperate Switzerland.
Yeah.
But I do think that in the ugly world of international affairs, if you don't act at certain points, then worse consequences can arise.
Yeah, and I think I don't, it's one of those issues on which I don't feel qualified to have a strong opinion at all. But I worry desperately. I don't think that, I worry that there are no good outcomes for Iran, and that's what scares me. But I desperately, obviously, hope that this works out now that it's started. But I think the other reason I have maybe a smidgen of sympathy for Keir Starmer, it's not often you hear me say these words in life.
He should cherish it.
I know, is that maybe it's a recognition of the pathetic and pitiful state of our armed forces and the situation that we're in.
Yes.
Like, how embarrassing that we cannot defend our own base in Cyprus. I mean, isn't that shocking?
No, there's a
we had to have the Greeks and the French sending their support.
There is a Royal Naval vessel chugging out there, which will arrive in a week. That Royal Naval vessel was identified by Tom Tugendhat yesterday as the vessel that should be in theatre. Keir Starmer seemed bemused. It was almost as though Tom Tugendhat had been speaking in Farsi to him when he mentioned the name of this Royal Naval ship.
Yes.
This Royal Naval
Type 45s as well. I mean,
quite.
Embarrassing.
Half of the vessels of this type are being refitted in port, and
Yes.
as was covered last week, or forgive me, the week before in the Spectator by Tim Shipman and others, we rely on the naval reserves to keep the Navy up to strength. So yes, it's a pretty dispiriting position.
And actually, the fact that Britain has been unable to defend its sovereign territory in Cyprus is really embarrassing. But it's also, the Cypriots have put in an official complaint that we weren't doing our duty in supporting them. And you know what? Now that we've decided that we're going to give away the Chagos Islands for reasons best understood by the lawyers, I think this has led the way to open season on people. Why not try your luck? Because we're clearly governed by mugs, right?
Yes.
But in this case, I think they have a point. We have manifestly failed in our duties, shirking obligations and leaving them to other countries to fulfil. So in an awful way, the saying we want nothing to do with it. Well, sometimes when I listen to the discussion we have about foreign policy and Britain's ability to contribute, I feel like the people engaging in this slightly bombastic discussion are living on a different planet with absolutely no understanding of how diminished we are. Like, it's the fact that when you talk to anyone in the armed forces, that they would, whichever aspect of it they're in, how sad it makes me that we only have one regiment in Scotland, for example. There's so many other examples. It's just depressing in the extreme.
Yeah.
So I suppose you don't earn the right to participate when that's the state of your armed forces,
That is true. Our politicians, generally, the House of Commons, the House of Lords, can draw itself up to its full pompous height sometimes when talking about international affairs and global conflict, forgetting the fact that our armed forces are in such a state of disrepair that we are
being bailed out by the French.
Yeah, we're not King Henry V, we're King Lear on the world stage.
Yeah, and actually France is a really good example of how you can have an independent foreign policy that's not just relying on America at all times.
Did you see, it pains me to say this, did you see the magnificent footage of Macron leading a chorus of La Marseillaise?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
In the nuclear submarine base.
There's another example, by the way, of a country that doesn't give any hoots about international law and just does what's in its national interests. Like, there is an alternative. It's not just a choice between being kicked around by these people or being America's bitch. There is an alternative, and if only we'd followed it.
Yes, that's one of the reasons why it's all the more important, Maddie, that in the future you're Secretary of State for Defence.
God help us if that happens.
So, Maddie, you were in the Commons watching Rachel Reeves when she gave her spring forecast, not spring statement, but essentially it was the Chancellor's opportunity to have half an hour at the dispatch box outlining her economic strategy and her forecasts for the future. Rachel Reeves took something of a battering when she had her budget last autumn. Kemi Badenoch had her for breakfast. But this time round, it was a slightly different Rachel Reeves.
Well, it was slightly more bullish. She definitely had a lot more vim than I have seen her have for some time. But I think it helped that fundamentally she wasn't doing anything difficult. She wasn't making any tough decisions. She was simply reiterating political talking points and saying how fantastic everything was in the economy. But if there are problems in the economy, it's all the fault of the Tories, Liz Truss mini budget, blah, blah, blah. We've heard it all 1,000 times before. So although she did a kind of strong performance, the content of what she was saying felt like nothing new. Although actually she did kind of open her statement by saying, like in very sort of hostage video style, this government has the right economic plan for our country. And everyone just lost the plot in the chamber because of the way she said it. It was in a very vacant manner. But yeah, I think she certainly rallied. I think there's also, I guess, a question for her about the wisdom, I think, of taking a self-congratulatory tone, because she was talking about economic forecasts, some of which have been upgraded on the last time that they were made, and saying, well, this is proof that everything's going fantastically well. But, famously, the economic forecasters are invariably wrong about everything.
Yes.
To tie your political flag to the mast of the OBR seems a bit like basing your future public policy on, bird entrails or something, because they're invariably wrong. So I think that was kind of a misstep. Or at least something she may come to regret, because what if it gets downgraded? What happens then?
I share your scepticism about the wisdom of relying on the OBR's forecasts. As has been pointed out, if you compare them with other forecasting organisations, they have one of the worst records. And notoriously, it was the case that J.K. Galbraith said that economic forecasting was introduced in order to make astrology seem respectable. But if all of the stats that you actually have are quite grim,
yes,
and at least the forecasts give you some hint of sunshine to come,
yes,
then you'll want to move away from the grim news, for example, on unemployment, and indeed the fact that growth's been downgraded this year, towards the sunnier prospects that appear to be the case with growth in the future. So I can understand why she did it, but I didn't get the sense, please tell me if I'm wrong, that within the forecast there was much detail about what the government's long-awaited growth strategy might be.
No, and some of the figures that she was crowing about were, by any normal historical UK standards, anemic and nothing to shout about. So in the short term, the immediate forecasts have been downgraded for the year 2026, but they get better, slightly better after that. And this is partly because there's an assumption of spending cuts in the run-ups to the next general election.
Like that's going to happen.
Now, I wonder about that, because, so far this government has shown that when there's a difficult economic decision to be made or a backbench rebellion, they reach not for the difficult cuts, but for the tax increases, which are not fantastic for stimulating growth and investment. And I don't trust Labour MPs necessarily to wear these proposals, even if it's something that Rachel Reeves would very much like them to do. And actually, the faces on many Labour MPs during the statement, well, they looked fairly grim to me. They didn't look happy at all points. That they did grow animated at certain moments, but it was generally when the Chancellor was talking about some kind of spending increase, such as the removal of the two-child benefit cap. And, although the Chancellor talked a lot about the state of the public finances that they inherited, nowhere was there any recognition that this government has increased the national debt by almost £200 billion since they took power. Blaming it on the other guy's strategy does have its limits. I wonder if there's a kind of statute of limitations of a point at which governments are just not allowed to blame the opposition for their predicaments, or to at least take some responsibility for what's happening.
Maybe there should be, but I can foresee, I'll probably be long gone, but when Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are in their care homes decades hence, I think it'll be the case that the nurse leaning over either of them will be saying, "Who's this Liz Truss, dear, that you keep talking about?" Because it's a name never off their lips. And if Liz wondered if she would ever achieve immortality in politics, then I think she can be grateful.
It's almost 4 years. It's almost 4 years since the budget.
I know, but it is for Labour the gift that keeps on giving, because it's the invocation of economic chaos that they will continually use in order to say, however bad you may think we are, the other side were irredeemably worse. But again, the more you talk about how bad the other guys were, the more obvious it is that the positive arguments about what you're doing appear to be evanescent.
The other thing that just struck me today, because, of course, when this spring forecast was announced, they couldn't have known that, events Dear Boy would kick off.
Yes, quite.
But there is also the question of just using these particular forecasts whilst kind of ignoring what further conflict in the Middle East could mean for the UK, food and energy inflation. That could grow worse, and it almost certainly will, unless there really is a swift cessation of hostilities. So it made the forecast, which always feel very like back of fag packet and a bit even more redundant than they normally do.
Yes, and I think that again it's making bricks with as little straw as there is, and so using whatever hand-me-down or whatever inadequate stats come to hand in order to try to create the impression of solidity.
And also we've touched on it before, but that it has become clear at the last budget that the government has made a choice that we are going to neglect our military in favour of pumping more and more money into the welfare state. They won't admit to that, but that is exactly what is happening. And It doesn't matter, apparently, what else goes on in the world, how chaotic and dangerous a place it becomes. Nothing seems to shake them from that belief. And I couldn't help but think that this felt even more irresponsible given everything else that was happening.
I think that's right. And at different times, including, I think, almost exactly a year ago, after Trump's inauguration, it was the case that Labour were talking then about the vital importance of national security and so on. And they have made noises about investment in defence, but we know from what the defence chiefs are saying, even if you take it with a pinch of salt, that it's nowhere near enough to meet the requirements that NATO and other allies expect of us. And again, the revealed preference of the Labour government is if a spare pound can be found and the choice is welfare or defence, then it will go on welfare.
Yes.
And even those areas that Rachel Reeves mentioned where there is reform occurring, small r, like, for example, over special educational needs, whatever one thinks of the details of the proposition that has been put forward by Bridget Phillipson, it's still the case that in the short term, definitely, it will see spending increase. So what we're not seeing is really any measure of economy in any area, and that means your earlier point about the assumption that there will be public spending reductions in advance of the general election seems more fantastical. And all the political pressure that occurs in the wake of the Gorton and the Denton by-election would appear to be for Labour to move to the left economically. I think one of the things that Reeves was trying to do was to try to remind Labour backbenchers why they should be cheerful about being Labour by scorning the Tory record and talking about the two-child benefit cap being lifted. But if you make people feel better by saying, look how much we're spending, then you create a path and a path dependency which takes you away from the overall spending control in most departments that you will need to satisfy the markets and to invest in defence.
Yes, and also she kept reiterating the importance of sticking to the plan and all of that, which I felt was an attempt to reach out to her backbenchers and say, we are making progress, but also, look, we can spend more on welfare. But kind of an audition for please don't eject me and the dear leader just yet because things are getting better. I'm not sure how persuasive that is. I know we've talked about it being something of a non-event, but given the build-up to the last big fiscal event, I mean, isn't that something of a relief? The amount of uncertainty and speculation and the damage that did to businesses that feverishly wondering for months what on earth is coming. Do you think that the decision to have just one of those per year is a sensible one?
Well, it's certainly the case. You're absolutely right that the Treasury and the government wanted this to be dull and as close to a non-event in economic terms as possible. And last week they briefed the Financial Times saying that it would be boring. And the Financial Times had a headline, which is boring statement, page 3. I think only the Financial Times would herald something as boring and therefore a must read. Well, maybe the New Statesman would as well, I don't know. Anyway, the broader point, though, about the sense of political satisfaction they might derive from that, I understand. But I remember George Osborne, when he was Chancellor, saying to me that the Treasury always told him that we just want one big fiscal event, 2 is destabilising, then we can concentrate on getting it right. And he thought, why the hell would I want to restrict my ability to command the narrative and to push things forward in a way that I believe in to just once a year? It's a classic example of what the Treasury want and what the machine wants, not necessarily being in line with what a reformer, even if you disagree with the reform, should want. So there may be an admirable fidelity to Treasury orthodoxy in Rachel Reeves' decision, but it's a missed opportunity.